see that, right?
Mhm.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Appreciate everybody coming to our webinar and panel discussion on best practices in cash culture today. I'm joined by Jose Fornell, TJ, and Lauren here. Jose Fornell is a partner with Impact Point and has been doing cash forecasting for over 20 years now. Lauren brings an interesting, perspective on the operating company side, leading FP&A for a complex multi-entity M&A heavy business. And then TJ has sat on both sides of the table, starting in investment banking, moving into private equity, and now is on the C-suite side at a portfolio company. So very excited to have this conversation today with everybody, going through again some best practices, and then leading off or following into our discussion on how these have been applied in people's organizations. So I'll let people give a quick intro on themselves, or the panelists give a quick intro on themselves. Jose, if you want to kick us off, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you, Ben, and thank you everybody for joining. And special thanks to Lauren and TJ. Just so everybody knows, Lauren and TJ are have been clients of ours for a while. Lauren on both ends, she's seen how we develop Excel 13-week cash flows in the past and how we established those up, as well as Pegasus, our cash management tool most recently. And TJ, same thing. Appreciate both of you guys for being here and for being clients of Impact Point. They're going to help us throughout the meeting with answering some of your questions and sort of what's been their experience around establishing a cash culture in their businesses. A bit about myself. To Ben's point, I've been doing this for the last 20 years, hundreds of cash flow forecasts. I started my career at Alvarez & Marsal. For those that don't know, it's a restructuring firm. And the bread and butter is cash flow forecasting, especially in liquidity, in tight liquidity situations. Did that for 10 years, eventually started Impact Point. One of the things that we do the most at Impact Point is actually doing 13-week cash flow forecasts. And then most recently, we invested in our tool called Pegasus Insights that basically provides, automated connectivity to your ERPs, to your bank accounts, and facilitates an insight-driven cash flow forecast. With that, I'll pass it on to Lauren and TJ before we start our conversation for a brief intro.
Yeah, I'm happy to go. I'm TJ Gebhardt. As Ben alluded to, I started my career in banking before going to business school. And then I joined Shore Capital, private equity firm here in Chicago. Spent about a year at the mothership, as I call it, before making the move to one of their operating companies called OWS Foods. We are a manufacturer of barbecue sauces and seasonings, which is a blast. First got exposed to the Pegasus tool while working with Shore. Was a huge fan and staying in close contact with Ben and the team, and I'm excited to be here today.
Yeah, nice to meet you guys. My name is Lauren Hedrick. I'm here with Legacy Food Group. Jose at Impact Point has helped us along the way as we've built out a full FP&A team and FP&A practice from the ground up. So first, again, got introduced to cash forecasting models through the Excel models, and then was part of the kind of initial beta testing with Pegasus. And I started my career initially in public accounting, moved over to M&A and mergers and acquisitions consulting for a few years before then ultimately going and working for a portfolio company and helping build that FP&A practice. And so it's been a really exciting time. We're also, again, in the food service industry. We buy independent food distributors.
Great. So, going into the agenda, Jose is going to take us through some best practices before the panel discussion.
Ben, I'll go back one slide before I start here. So I'll start with a brief story that I think highlights the importance of a really tight and a good direct cash flow methodology, process or methodology. A few years ago, I was brought into a client that suspected that they were having liquidity problems. Basically, what's happening was they had been burning cash, but the company was telling them, the management team was telling them that it was short-lived, that they were turning the corner, that revenue was coming up, that costs were actually lower than what they were seeing in terms of actual disbursements. Long story short, they brought me in to analyze the cash flows, and what I did was I built a really insights-driven 13-week cash flow forecast. And usually you start by doing that by establishing your historical model first, understanding actually what is actually going out the door. But what's very interesting about this is because of the methodology that we use, that is insights-driven and heavy focus on understanding your actual cash flows, how they operate versus how a P&L operates, we found some things that were different from what the team suspected. We found that there were some external investments that were being made on a quarterly basis that had not been accounted for in the company's cash flow forecast. And then we also found that the revenue forecast was based on the budget that they were not hitting. They were actually missing the revenue forecast. We found these based on the process that we used to develop our cash flow forecasts. And also by bringing in the entire organization to help us understand the different areas of the business, the different functional areas. What we found was that they weren't going to be turning the corner. They actually needed about $20 million of a cash infusion. And that's funding that prevented them from actually going into bankruptcy. And what ended up happening was, because we found that they were able to invest in the business, bring some money, some outside money from the lenders as well. Then we kicked up a zero-based budgeting process, and it ended up being one of the most successful exits from that private equity firm. All because we took the time to actually understand the cash flows properly and have an insights-driven forecast. That, in a nutshell, to me, is really what a good cash flow process should be able to do, right? It should be able to give you the right insights and bring an organization to support the right forecast. So with that said, let me tell you a little bit about how we think about establishing an organizational-wide cash culture, and what are the key elements for that. Ben, let's go to the next slide. Let's keep these one. We'll send, by the way, we're going to send these to everybody in this call. So I'm going to cover a few slides in more levels of detail than others. As once you receive these or after the call, if you have any questions, you want to chat, feel free to email us. So I'm going to start here, right? What are actually the key elements that you need to be focused on to have a successful cash culture in your business? So I normally split these into 3 elements. You're going to see the people side, then tools and systems, and services, right? Those are the services that are provided by the people side. You got to consider who are the key people on a cross-functional basis. So make sure that you understand your sales, procurement, ops, HR. They are going to have elements that the FP&A team or the finance team might not be aware that you need to bring into the cash forecasting process. Obviously, your FP&A or treasury, in some cases, your cash is going to be driven by FP&A, in some cases by treasury. It depends on your resources. And then obviously your CFO ultimately accountable to making sure that the cash forecast or the cash picture is clearly understood. Moving on to the right-hand side, onto the services, meaning the services from a cash perspective that people team or that FP&A or treasury team need to be able to produce. They need to be able to provide reporting around variances, dashboarding, cash balances, actuals, obviously forecasting, which is the key element here. But they should also understand what are the key initiatives that they're driving, right? Any good cash flow forecast to me should not only include the forecast, But we should be learning about the forecast and establishing initiatives around improving working capital, right? Or, you know, understanding what the different scenarios might be with cash, potential cash savings, or different procurement initiatives. And these should be tracked and identified in the cash flow forecast. Then obviously identify the right systems to bring the data from. Your core data is going to come from your ERP. Think about your AR, AP, invoice, payroll, and a lot of your actuals. Your business intelligence might have certain metrics that are important. Pipeline of sales, for example, so that you can understand your forecast beyond your accounts receivable. And then your forecasting tools, I normally think about two, right? You have your direct, so that's a typical 13-week cash flow. I normally think about those as being short to mid-term, 13 weeks to maybe 26 weeks. And then your indirect, right? This to me is your statement of cash flows in your financial statements. And the goal to having these two is they should be close, right? Having these two should come from different directions. One is more bottoms up, the other one's more tops down, but they should be roughly telling the same story. I've had multiple situations where having both has actually helped me refine the entire cash flow forecast for the organization as a whole, because you see that one might have some insights, the other one might have others. So I always recommend make sure that you're tracking both. So to me, these are the key elements. I'm going to dive in a little bit deeper into these ones before we give you some examples and open it up for the panel. Let's go to the next slide, Ben. So when we talk about people, how do I think about these, right? You have the leaders of the cash forecasting process. On the left-hand side, those are going to be your CFOs, FP&A, treasury leads. They're going to be owning the tools, 13 weeks, doing an EBITDA to cash, statement to cash flows. They're responsible for identifying the risks and the mitigation strategies, and make sure that they are leveraging these tools to support any kind of investment decisions. Going all the way to the right-hand side, where you see cross-functional support, these are the key items or the key functional areas that you need to bring into the process. Your AP clerks are going to be critical. They're going to help you understand payment terms. Your AR folks are going to help you understand your collection cycles. HR is going to tell you, hey, are we hiring somebody? Do we have any recruiting fees that we've got to pay? Sales team is going to better help you understand your sales pipeline and the risk to that, right? A lot of times we have budgets or we have forecasts that can be a little bit on the rosier side, right? This group is going to help you understand that. Purchasing, especially if you have a lot of purchase orders, you need to bring them in so that you understand anything beyond your AP, anything beyond your next 4 weeks. That team is going to tell you what's coming down the pipeline to help understand what you're going to be paying. Legal, there might be some legal fees, especially you're heavy on the M&A side, that you need to be able to keep track of. And facilities, you might have some CapEx. So again, all these groups I bring in at least once a month. So now if you go to the middle of the page where you say communication enablers, what I normally do is I bring that lead team and that cross-functional team, I bring them together once a month to have conversations around what they're seeing in terms of an updated forecast. Right? Usually I try to do maybe 15 minutes with each of these areas once a month, and you will learn enough to make sure that you have a good handle on what those functional areas and how those functional areas might impact your forecast. Right, so that's the people side. Again, very important to bring these two sides together and have a formal standing meeting to go through the updated forecasts. Let's go on to the next slide. On the services side, some key tips for you in terms of how the forecast and reporting and initiatives, what they should be able to accomplish. On the forecasting side, the cadence, normally have, like I said before, 13 to 26 weeks weekly direct cash flow forecast, then a monthly or quarterly indirect cash flow forecast, more strategic, right? 6 to 24 months out. A scenario is very important. I always like to build at least a base case and a downside. In some cases, I might build an upside case, but certainly a base and downside case are very, very critical. Make sure that you're reconciling your indirect and direct forecast. This gives you a lot of information. What you're gonna find is usually your indirect is gonna be a bit more optimistic, and your direct is gonna tend to be more conservative. But having both the scenarios and trying to reconcile both, especially once a quarter, I think can help you really, fine tune your cash flow scenario. On the reporting, really important to make sure that there is what we call variance discipline. So make sure that you have on a weekly basis actual versus forecast. That is basically, hey, what did we forecast for last week? What actually happened? How much did we collect? Who do we pay? But at the same time, your forecast versus forecast, right? So for the last week we forecasted, we had a forecast for 13 weeks. How did those same 13 weeks change 1 week out, right? Keep track of that. Is going to help you understand, like, there's nothing worse than having 1 week and then the next week having significant variances. These forecast versus forecast, if you do it every week, really helps minimize that risk. Having cash visibility, make sure that you have a way of having your daily cash position, and make sure that you have good handle on your KPIs, DSO, DPOs, inventory, and then if you're in a tight liquidity situation, that you're tracking your covenants. Then finally, initiatives, right? Like, to me, anything that I do on FP&A, I'm always thinking, what is this telling me, and can I improve my business with this information? This is the opportunity for that FP&A team, that finance team, to really add value, right? So it's not just about a forecast. It's about, like, here's a forecast, but by the way, we're seeing some of these opportunities. When I look at my accounts receivable, I'm looking that, there's a few clients that tend to pay late all the time. What can we do about it, right? So that's in terms of initiatives. A good source for you, if you ever want to do some benchmarking, go into Dun & Bradstreet. They have and if you don't find it, let me know. But they have a really good database by industry, where you can go in and better understand DSOs, DPOs, that type of information by type of industry. So happy to point you in that direction. But have those benchmarks, right? Because a lot of times that PE group is trying to push on collections, improve working capital, and understanding what's realistic by industry can be quite helpful. All right, let's go to the next slide. This is the last slide that I spent quite a bit of time. Then I'm going to move on to some examples and to the panel. Tool and systems. So again, going to the left and the right first before we converge into the middle of this slide. On the left-hand side, two key sources of data: your ERP and your bank. ERP, that's where you're going to get your check registers, accounts payable, and accounts receivable. On the bank side, obviously, your balance, transaction data, and revolver availability. These are the two core data systems. If you go all the way to the right, you might have additional data on some HRIS systems or Power BI, some other Excel files. So make sure you understand where some of that other business intelligence, sales pipeline, where that might be. And then these two data sources need to converge into the two models that we discussed previously. So if you look at that triangle, there's two items in green there. One, it says direct cash flow model. The other one says indirect cash flow model. Those are the two models that you should always be thinking to build. Again, indirect, more long-term; direct, more short-term and more tactical. That direct is going to help you understand your liquidity runways. Are there any collections issues or AR timing? Help monitor your covenants and debt service. Manage seasonality better. Manage your payables. Help understand where you should be negotiating with your vendors. Then if you go to the middle of that triangle, you're going to see what we call the sort of cross-cutting, so above the two horizons, right? In both models, build the two models. If you're in a crisis mode, right, build the two. That's what we did in that example that I mentioned at the beginning of the call. we had the two models. The indirect we used mainly for the bank to inform them what we needed, and the direct was a way of managing our liquidity in the short term and pressure testing the indirect version. And then that indirect version, all the way to the top of that pyramid, right, being more strategic, more long term, that should help you with your board communications. That helps you understand your M&A activity and how that's going to be impacting in the longer term. Do some scenario planning, manage your lender as well. Many lenders ask for these for lender reporting on a quarterly basis or monthly basis. Understand your capital structure and plan for it, and help better forecast your capex. So with that, we've covered the framework around sort of the tools and how to think about it, the people, what they should be doing, who you should be bringing together, and how to think about your services that FP&A team should be reporting, again, around your initiatives, your reporting, variance analysis, so on and so forth. With that said, I'm going to spend just a couple more minutes on a few things. Let's go to the next slide, Ben. We're going to share these with you again, but here's some best practices. I'm not going to cover them in detail, but I'm going to mention one. If you go to the bottom of the slide, the third from the bottom, book versus bank, there's one thing that I always am very adamant about. Build your forecast on a book basis, not on a bank basis. And the reason is, on a book basis, you're basically forecasting when the payment goes out, when that check goes out. That's what's under your control. On the bank basis, you're going to be chasing when things clear, and that's really, really painful process. So what you do is you have your book balances from your balance sheet, and you forecast when I'm going to be sending the payments out instead of when things are going to clear. It's going to make your life around variance analysis, understanding your actuals much, much simpler. So that's the one main thing that I want to cover. And again, we're going to be sharing these with you after the call. And one more time, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. I'm going to cover some high-level overviews of what I mean for direct cash flow forecasting, and then I'm going to open it up for Lauren and TJ. Ben, let's go to the next section, please. All right. So this is an example of what your output should look like on a direct cash flow methodology, right? It's similar to a P&L. So if you look at the first line, you're going to see customer collections instead of revenue. And then you're going to be operating disbursements instead of OPEX, right? Here you have your materials and parts. That's the payments that you're going to be making instead of the COGS, right? You're going to have your payroll. You're going to have your facilities, your freight, so on and so forth. And then below that section where you see that second number 2, you're going to have non-operating disbursements. So these are the below the line items. These are the things that are like, debt payments, CapEx, and especially if you're heavy on the M&A side, these is where a lot of those payments are gonna come through. I always try to make sure that operating cash flow line from here, it's close to my EBITDA, right? It helps sort of try to reconcile those as best you can. Not always feasible because there's some accruals that happens and some amortizations that happen, but always try to tie that as close as possible to your EBITDA. But this should be what you're building towards. This is your key output. How do you get to here? And we do it very similarly, whether it's Excel or whether we do it in Pegasus. Let's go a couple of slides down, Ben. Skip the actual forecast for now. Go back up one slide. So here's how we build it, right? What you see here is we actually go down to the vendor level detail. Going back to the example where I started this conversation, the only reason why we were able to identify what everybody had missed was because we traced your historicals on the vendor level basis, and we made sure that our changes in cash matched to all the vendor and customer level transactions. And so now I'm not saying that you have to have every single vendor, but have those that make sense, right? Maybe you put a threshold like, hey, anybody that I'm paying over $20,000 a month, those are the ones that we're gonna be tracking. And usually a good number to think about is what are your top, 40, the top 30 clients. That's going to give you, vendors that is going to give you, many cases, 60% of your cash flows, if not more. So those are the ones that we try to understand: the historical behavior, the forecast behavior, and this is where you would bring in the other functional areas to help you budget for them too, right? So again, if you're forecasting legal, now you have a legal section, and you can drive it with that functional area, and they actually have a section here where they can contribute. This is an Excel version, but if you think about Pegasus, you're going to have the exact same level of insights, but just in Pegasus. Then the final thing I'll say, if you go back up one slide, Ben. Once you do the forecast, we always like to do an actual versus forecast every week. So it's going to look something like this. The first column is going to be your actuals. This is where you're going to report what did you actually pay or collected last week. Right next to it, your forecast. Then over to the right, that's where we put in the variances. This is what helps us learn. The reason why this actual versus forecast is so critical to do is because it helps. It's an ongoing learning process for the organization. So with that, I'll stop. I'll turn it over to Ben so that he can open up the panel conversation. Please, as we go through these, any questions that you have, send those questions over for us, and we'll start responding to those questions. Oh, one last thing. If you look at here, if you're interested, scan that QR code. If you want to book a demo on Pegasus or conversation with us, we offer free analysis of your existing cash flow management processes, and we can also offer a free working capital assessment. So if you're interested, scan that or send us an email. And if you have any questions, feel free to click on that Q&A button and send us those questions. With that, Ben, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, great. So moving into sort of the panel discussion and talking about this in the real world. So this is going to be a bit of an open conversation between the four of us here. I'm going to go through with some that are more focused to specific situations. But Jose, Lauren, TJ, feel free to build on any answers and keep it conversational. So starting, Jose, with yourself. So, as you mentioned, you've done cash flow forecasting for 20 years now. I assume that's across a lot of industries, a lot of different clients, and, a lot of different scenarios. If you're thinking across every single one that you've seen, and maybe not every single one, but what are the most common, challenges or themes or things that you want to make sure you get right as you're approaching, as a team's approaching a good cash culture and forecasting methodology?
Yeah, to me, the most important learning, and I'll repeat this again, I said it earlier in the call, build a good set of historical cash flows. I mean, I cannot state how critical that is. What happens in many cases, and it happens to me when I'm interviewing people to hire, right? And people that have done 13 weeks in the past, I ask them, what's the first thing that you would do? And they start explaining to me how they would build, an AR forecast, an AP forecast. But AR and AP can be incomplete, right? Like, for example, your rent doesn't flow through your AP. Your investments don't necessarily flow through AP. So what I always say is, like, build a really good set of historicals that reconcile to changes in cash. You're going to learn quite a few things that are going to contradict the forecast, and you're going to find out a few things that are not included in your accounts receivable or accounts payable.
Great. And then, obviously we've, moved as a firm from focusing more on like Excel delivery to more tech enabled with, Pegasus, right? As you're thinking about that and reflecting, what was the biggest thing, on your mind that decided that, this was something we need to do and invest in?
Yeah. So, looking at clients, one of the things that we discussed, right, with clients was they were spending unnecessary time pulling together bank transaction reports and ERP reports or check registers for multiple entities, because a lot of our clients are highly acquisitive. So they were spending a lot of time just trying to pull together the pieces. And what we wanted to do was change the time that they were spending pulling together the pieces and having them invest that time into understanding an insights-driven forecast, improving their working capital, generating savings. And so we went out to the market and tried to find, is there a system out there that can help bridge that gap? There were a few, but none that really actually solved the problem in the way that we thought it should be solved. Again, like really good insights on your historicals, having scenarios, having variance analysis, all that stuff. So with that, we decided to build our own system that solved for all of that. So now what we're seeing, we actually had a survey done with our clients very recently, and the number one thing that they listed as Payos being fantastic for them was that it gave them the insights necessary to feel comfortable when explaining their cash flow forecasts either to their CFOs or to the boards. So that's a game changer, right? Like we took him from, hey, spend your time figuring out your actuals or pulling, trying to get a sense of what should be driving it, to actually, hey, here you have all your data. Now focus your time thinking about how you're going to manage your cash flow and what you should be forecasting.
Great. And then shifting gears a little bit, going down to you, TJ. So as I mentioned at the top, I think you bring a really interesting dynamic, having done this on both ends. But if you're thinking about your experience, on the private equity side as well as the portfolio company management side, what do you see as the biggest difference between proper management in those two seats?
Yeah, I think it's something that I didn't appreciate it till I did it. When I was at Shore and working for the firm, cash was a KPI, right? It was either up or down. It was, below or above where we thought it would be, and it was a number we would look at, but it was not, something we really lived in. And then, when I moved to the operating side of the table, that changed, right? I mean, you've got a million competing priorities, and cash is one of the many. And it is not just the number; it is a series of actions, of cultures that go into making that number happen. And then there's the flip side of the coin too, where it's more than just a number. It is something that, in theory, you should be driving insights and action out of. And so I think that's probably the biggest difference between the two. One is looking at a number and understanding what it is, and the other is looking at a number and understanding what it means and what should be done or not done based on that number.
Yeah, that's super helpful. That's great insight on, it's more than past a KPI. It is truly, it's truly things we need to do, customers we need to go after, phone calls we need to make to actually have, to actually have an impact on that. So, if you're thinking again from like the private equity view, and especially with this, like context you've got on both ends, if you're suggesting to like a private equity operator who's going in and they're trying to understand like existing culture management tools in place, what are some things like you might look for on the private equity side to really assess that management team and how they're doing with their current process? Anything that gives you, any indicators you've noticed that would give you like confidence, or maybe something that would, be a cause of concern in your eyes.
Yeah, it's funny. I've worked with quite a few companies, and especially those that were, say family owned before, the idea of monitoring cash on a weekly or monthly basis was foreign. And so I think pretty quickly you can tell whether there's a plan in place or not. I mean, I think it really just boils down to, and from a good starting spot, it's asking three questions. It's, where is your cash coming from? Where is it going? And, how does your actual results, vary from, what it thought it was going to be? And so you can look at things like asking the question of like, is there a cadence in which you review cash, right? If not, and it's just you open your bank account and see where it is at a given day, there is not a process, and, that's an easy starting spot. From an ownership perspective, if there is a cadence, who's owning that, right? I mean, if it's this diffused responsibility among a lot of people, there's really no one singular person or function. And, that should be someone within the finance function that lives, breathes that, and can answer, the questions. Accuracy would be another one too, right? Some people claim that they have a process in place, and, they never really go back and understand, is what we're doing working? Are we accurate in what we're doing? Do we need to tweak what we're doing? And so I think there's, depending upon where the company is starting from, there's a couple different things you can look at. Some, I would say, red flags would be multiple versions of the truth, right? I mean, if you ask, different people those same three questions I asked earlier, if you get different responses, there's probably a hint that there's something missing there. Manual spreadsheets are great. And one thing that we've appreciated about Pegasus is automating it. There's always room for human error, right? Missing a zero, copying in the wrong cell or whatever. And so knowing that, the human element is taken out of it is a huge plus. And then I think the biggest thing you can do from a, operating thing is just avoid surprises, right? I mean, numbers will go up and down. That's to be expected, but any material surprises that you were not forecasting or aware of before they happen is where you will both get yourself in trouble and lose credibility. And I think that's the biggest thing a cash forecasting tool can do, among many things, is, making sure that, there aren't those misses, or if there are misses, certainly not anything that's unexpected.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Super helpful, TJ, and love the messaging around visibility. Jose, sort of a similar thing that you've done in your career. Obviously, going into a lot of different companies, looking at processes and things like that. Posing that question as well to you, in your mind, what are some things you sort of look for as leading indicators that cash might be well controlled versus where there might be an opportunity for improvement?
Well, look, if you have a variance analysis, then that means it's well controlled. To me, that is the ultimate litmus test. If there's a process for variance analysis, that means that people are paying attention to it, and with proper explanations, right? It's not just the sake of here's what happened, here was my forecast, but actually being able to understand why were my collections lower. Does that mean that our revenue was coming down, or does that mean that our DSO is going up, right? Being able to provide that second order insights. That to me is a telltale sign of a process that is running well. Then the second thing I would say is that actually creating initiatives? Again, if you're looking at your AR, if you're getting some of those insights, if you're looking at your AP, there should be questions. Are there certain customers that keep paying us late? Are there certain vendors that we are paying early, right? If that cash flow process is generating initiatives, then I think that's another telltale sign that things are being run well. You should always land with, how can we do things better?
Makes perfect sense. And then also, Lauren, your take on that, obviously going in, at a more like centralized level, if you're thinking about when you're acquiring companies and working with different teams at the operating level, anything you look for that like teams have done well, or, what do you look for as sort of like the gold standard when you're working with different operating units?
Yeah, I think for us, similar to echoing what TJ was saying, we have acquired a lot of just family-owned businesses in the past that logged into their bank account and looked at the balance, and if it was, somewhere where they felt comfortable, they're like, "Yep, cash is great." That's kind of a lot of what we deal with, and so I think just for us, like I would say the gold standard is like someone willing to learn, and learn what those variance analysis looks like, just at the local operating level, which is just so critical of getting their input and trying to figure out, what happened, or collections lower because someone's paying us late, or is it we missed a day of mail or something like that. So I think that's really key for us, is just the cooperation level, and then the willing, just adapting to, hey, this is what we're going to do. We're going to every single week look at cash instead of just logging to the bank account. We are going to sit there and say, okay, what have we got coming out? What do we know we've got coming in? I think that's really been a learning curve, for a lot of our operating divisions, but it's critical, and getting the buy-in from everyone is definitely the key.
Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, I think it echoes sort of that, cash forecasting, cash management, and ultimately like driving around those business objectives. It's more than just numbers, it's more than just math. It's truly sort of like culture, numbers and analytics, driving culture, driving decisions. So great insight from everybody there. So TJ, going back to you, and you sort of mentioned this a little bit, but obviously you've got in your sort of private equity strategy, you've got a lot of smaller, lower market companies coming on. Some of them might be, family owned as kind of the culture, culture change, and you're trying to instill those best practices. But if you think of something like, Pegasus and maybe, some of the opcos, you've worked on, what do you think are the benefits and sort of like the eyes of a private equity firm of having, knowing there's a tool in place?
I'd say number one would just be confidence, right? I mean, when you invest in a tool like Pegasus, you get peace of mind knowing there is a process in place. And it is it was an automated process in our case, and one in which it was very easy to use, right? And so everything that we talked about, right? Understanding your cash outflows, where your cash is coming from, where it's going. And then I think most importantly, the variance, makes it really easy to have that one-stop shop. And so Ben, I think about the time where we first worked together, it was definitely a low mid-market companies. And we were handling payments out of Zelle, right? I mean, and you're sitting there and the idea of creating a cash forecast when, you're waiting for, Sarah from down the street to pay you via Zelle is a lot tougher to do. And so in that case, it was a perfect tool to give us the discipline and consistency to help build out a process and something that we could kind of skip a bunch of steps and have something that we could trust kind of, relatively quickly. And then I've also used, Pegasus on some of the larger opportunities we have. And in those mid-market opportunities, you have the advantage of typically already having some sort of process in place. But, I think where Pegasus shines is its ability to, scale up, right? And so as you have multiple operating divisions, as your, thousands become 10,000s and 10,000s become 100,000s, there is the tools that you can build upon and build a trusted, scalable, consolidated version across different business units.
Great, and then I think that's a great segue into something I have for Lauren there. So, obviously we've been working with your group for quite some time, and through that, I know you've done a lot of acquisitions. I know you've bought on, companies and integrating them together. If you think about cash flow forecasting and like processes in place when a business is doing M&A, rapid fire, what have historically been some of your biggest pain points?
I think just timing. A lot of times, like Jose was saying earlier, it's just waiting on those initial reports and bank transactions and AR details. Just the timing and compilation has really been a heavy lift. It obviously gets a little bit better when you have a more managed process. And then with Pegasus, we're now no longer waiting on, okay, let's get your bank activity for the week. The banks are just linked. We can go in and see balances. We can go in and see activity. So I think that's really been key, and you're spending a lot less time doing the reconciling and the formatting, and updating all these manual spreadsheets, because that was definitely a big pain point for us. And then when you bring on a new acquisition, it's even if you do have the Excel models, it's tailoring that Excel model to the new company, and then incorporating that into your consolidated model. And with Pegasus, it's just okay, link your new bank account and do your forecast in there. It's definitely a lot more seamless.
That's great to hear. So, as you think about, organizational priorities and things that you're doing there, Lauren, besides, maybe a better quality of life, and getting to spend more time doing hobbies and things like that, anything that, you've been able to, strategic initiatives, as you think about moving towards automation, what's been some value of just other activities that you've been able to pick up with a relatively small team?
I think just again the ability to be able to be proactive instead of reactive. When you're by the time you're compiling, 6, 7, 8 different cash flow models together, it was like Thursday afternoon, sometimes Friday morning, looking at the end of the day, Friday prior week, and you've just kind of eaten up an entire week, and then you're also like, okay, well now we're almost 5 days from what that cash in that point of time looks like, and so I think we've really been able to shift our focus from okay, building all these models and compiling all the information to, okay, now if we see, we've got a liquidity crunch coming up in the next couple months, how can we, go after specific customers or identify certain areas where we might be able to alleviate that? And we've just been able to spend a lot more time with such a lean team doing those sort of activities.
Perfect. Perfect. Yeah, it's very common trend that just, by the time you get the model together, by the time you get the data, like the traditional way that, it's already outdated, right? As soon, the joke is as soon as you publish a forecast, it's now wrong, right? So, having the ability to be more reactive and focus on, actually driving that value add impact is, fantastic. As you've bought on these like legacy business, maybe non sort of finance teams or maybe the owner operators, and you're instilling sort of better forecasting, better like cash practices, or overall on the finance side, like any big like aha moments, anything that you've seen, like really click in that experience that have helped, drive overall business performance?
Yeah, I think for us, again, it's mostly been family-owned businesses. They definitely did not have budgets or forecasts for their financials, much less for cash. So I think just getting that involvement and seeing, exactly how cash is, it drives everything that goes on in the business. We've been able to go to the buyers meetings. Our buyers have procurement meetings once a month. And so we actually went and presented the cash forecast and showed them, here's what your buying activities do, here's how it impacts it. And so I think for me, just being able to see the finance teams at our local divisions coordinating and communicating with those operational teams has been huge. And it's really helped us avoid a lot of surprises when, we never want, our buyers to pass up a great deal, just because it's not in the forecast. But hey, we can put it in the forecast. As soon as you know about the deal, let us know about it. And those things have really been game changing.
That's great. That's great. And then this was for both of you. But as we think about like cash culture, forecasting, things like that, there's generally a bit of like a chicken and the egg problem. Do you focus on the cultural change first? Do you think about, deploying the tools first? How do you think about balancing those two, right? As you're trying to instill some of these like, shifts as well as getting the right like insights in place. What do you think is sort of the benefit of approaching it in either order?
Yeah, I know it's a bit of a cop out, but I don't think it necessarily has to be an either or. And the reason I say that is, I think it's a tool or process and a culture will both reinforce each other, and they don't need to be perfect, but I think implementing them together will make the overall output stronger. And I think, if there's a case where you have one or the other, great. I mean, that's easy. But if, Ben, again, I think about the first time that we worked together, neither of those two existed. And, I think you can use the tool to build the culture and the culture to help reinforce the tool. And it can be a little bit of a loop. The only downside of that is it can be daunting and overwhelming, especially if you're going to 0 to 100, right? But I think instilling that, and I think that's the benefit you and I had talked about of instilling it early too, right? If day one you set kind of this, hey, we are going to implement a tool and a culture of X, it's a lot easier to do than, kind of letting people settle in and then trying to disrupt things later on.
Great point. Great point.
Yeah, I echo everything, TJ, that you were saying. For us, again, we typically start with no culture or a tool at the divisions when we've purchased them, and so I think it was definitely a little daunting trying to implement both at the same time. I think that's where you guys came in and really helped us out with the implementation of our initial cash flow models, and I think being able to use the tool to kind of show like here's what we're trying to get at really does help reinforce that culture. And yeah, I think it can be daunting, but I think, yeah, like you said, TJ, they reinforce each other and it just is a continuous cycle.
Awesome. And then second to last one here, but there's two ways we really think about, or at least I think about like managing cash. There's one scenario where you're doing it to make sure you're looking at this over a 13-week basis, you're able to meet all of your upcoming obligations. And then there's the other one where it's got a lot more focus, where you're maybe in like more of a liquidity crunch and you're actually looking into individual payment timing and collection side. In your experience, how do you think about, different approaches, different, valuable KPI input into certain things as you're thinking about managing through maybe a more routine liquidity situation, and then again, maybe that liquidity crunch?
Yeah, happy to take this one because I've unfortunately had experiences with both, and I will say that the routine forecasting is way more fun and enjoyable. I would say from a KPI perspective, they're actually pretty similar, right? I mean, in a routine environment, it's about planning, optimization, decision-making, things of those nature, and you're going to look at variances and everything like that. I think the biggest thing that we've seen in our kind of critical liquidity crunch situations is the cadence changes. I'm thinking of one in particular where we met Monday, Wednesday, Friday to review the same KPIs, but you're looking at it at a much different time horizon. So instead of looking at it over a 13-week period, we literally say, what have we collected today and what can we afford to pay today? And, we'll do that same song and dance, every other day until we no longer have to. And so I think it's understanding, inflows, outflows, and variances regardless. I think it's the time horizon that you're evaluating it against, and then the periods in which you're meeting, whether that's, weekly, biweekly, hourly, daily, is kind of what changes given the environment.
Yeah, hopefully you're not running an hourly model.
I've been pretty close.
Yeah, I think thankfully we've been relatively fortunate in the last couple of years, which has been really nice that we're not facing those challenges for the most part. But yeah, again, just I can think back to when we first started kicking off some of these cash flow models. We were 5 days prior that we were looking at, and yeah, like you said, then it's once you publish the forecast, it's automatically wrong. And so I think, yeah, the timing just becomes so critical in those liquidity crunches, and just the ability to manage through it, and the ability to see all of your vendors that you're paying and the frequency, and look on that specific, again, customer level, and see what customers can you really, try to push for payments, and then what payments that you were paying can you push off. I think just having that visibility is so critical.
That's awesome, Lauren. And then, for both of you, right? Like if we've got somebody on, the call today, or just in general, if they're, on the more operational side or C-suite, or maybe they're a finance leader or CFO, and they don't really have a good process or a good culture in place yet. If you had one thing that you could recommend to them that they would do, do today or do tomorrow, what would that be, and where would be the best place to start?
I think
Yeah.
for me, oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I would say I think for me, just start looking at it before it becomes too late. Start looking at it before you're in that liquidity crunch, and just the more frequently you're looking at it, and if you've got a tool that you can trust, when you start looking at it frequently, you can avoid some of those and navigate around some of the possible liquidity crunches. I think that's what's really been critical and been part of the success for us.
Yeah, I would piggyback off that. I would say just get started, right? I mean, it doesn't need to be perfect. It's not going to be perfect at day one. In fact, I don't think there's ever a thing as a perfect cash forecast, but just starting the process, whether that's just starting to have visibility into, hey, here were our outflows and inflows. And the only last thing I would add would be accountability too. I think having a point of contact, whether that's a team or a person that really takes ownership of that, ensures that it's being maintained and monitored and all that. And, like I mentioned earlier, it helps diffuse the responsibility where there's the one or, team or individuals that can really start by taking ownership and, just continue to evolve and iterate from there.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And then Jose, we'd love to
I want to
hear your
echo,
thoughts as well.
what Lauren and TJ said here. Look, I think a lot of folks sometimes think that a more detailed 13-week cash flow or direct cash flow is needed when there is a liquidity problem. But the reality is you need it to actually avoid a liquidity problem, or to flag it ahead of time, because to Lauren's point, you're going to see liquidity crunches quite often, right? And there's no worse thing that, hey, there's a liquidity crunch coming, and all of a sudden you have to pull the revolver on your business, and you just give basically a week notice or a few days notice. Doesn't play down well with the CFO, doesn't play down well with the PE, doesn't play down well with the CEO, and it doesn't really help the organization longer term. So I think there doesn't have to be a tight liquidity situation or a crisis essentially, but just recognizing that there's going to be times where the business is going to go through liquidity crunches, and be able to navigate those. I think it's really important to be ready for those and avoid them. And if you get them and you have this process in place, you're going to be able to navigate it much easier. So again, you don't need to be into a crisis, to have a tool like this, or to be able to plan your cash flows properly. I think it actually will help you never to get into that spot. By the time you get into that spot, which is common with a lot of businesses, if you look at a 5-year period, you're gonna go through some liquidity crunches. But you don't want to be the one that's giving the notice saying, "Oh, you know what? We got to pull the revolver. We didn't know. And we got to pull it in a week."
That's great. That's great. And then we have 4 minutes left in the time. Isa, Maggie, wanted to see if there's anything, for Warren, TJ, and myself, or Jose, in the chat, any questions we can cover?
I don't think we have anything in the chat, but we do have some items that we think would be beneficial for our team to answer. Things that I've heard from our past clients as well. So just give me 1 second. One thing that has come up, how do you make sure that you're handling all non-recurring items in your forecast as efficiently as possible?
That cross-functional team.
Okay.
And that's where you learn about that. That's why, when we go back down to that framework, that's exactly why I bring that point out around people, right? It's not a process that should be just, yes, the leaders, the people that are ultimately responsible is that CFO, that finance team.
Mm-hmm.
But they need to be informed by the rest of the organization. So establishing that formal process will make sure that you understand all of those non-recurring items. Because everything else, the recurring things, your finance team will be able to understand what those are. But the non-recurring usually come from the functional areas. They are the ones that know what's coming. That's why you bring them into the process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great point. You want to always avoid that's finances forecast, that's finances budget. Because yes, we can look at like operational forecasting, you can look at AR, you can look at AP, and you can always come up with at least directionally very good forecast without input from sort of the ops side. But when you have that exceptional spend, or you have like a special one-off project, if it's not in the budget, that finance gets, and it comes up throughout the year, that needs to come from IT, that needs to come from, whoever is in the team. So it's the importance of pushing down, ownership to everybody in the business, that they don't get to just surprise you. It needs to be, planned in advance. And yeah, it's all about the culture.
Yeah, got to build that cash culture. Okay, fantastic. I think a couple of the other ones we may have already answered during our conversation. But if anyone in the chat or in the meeting has any questions, feel free to pop it in the Q&A or in the chat. Otherwise, like Jose has mentioned, we are more than happy to answer anything afterwards. Please feel free to send us an email, get in contact with us. More than happy to see how.
I'm going to reiterate one thing, Isa. Look, of course we have a tool called Pegasus. We are a consulting firm as well, but we don't need a project to support you. And those that have been my clients, know that, like, we're always happy to pressure test ideas with you, to help you, to teach you, to give you templates, playbooks. So don't hesitate to reach out. Again, we don't need a project to support you guys. So anything that we can do, reach out. We'll be happy to help. Thank you, everybody, for your time. Let us know if you need anything. Have a good afternoon.
Have a good one.